If you have your Bibles with you, can you put your finger in them at Genesis chapter 45, please? We're not going to have it up on the screen immediately. We're going to finish with it like we did last week. I'm going to lead you to that point. We've been working through a series looking through the Old Testament. We started right the way back with Adam and Eve, and we've been particularly looking at the people. And yes, we've looked at the context that they were in, and yes, we've looked at what God says to us through what was going on around and how God worked through what was going on around. But we've looked at them as people. And one of the main reasons for this is I wanted us to understand how God works, sometimes despite us. We're all human beings, we all have frailties, we all have failings, and yet God chooses to partner with us. God is God. He could do what he likes, and yet he chooses to partner with us and work with us and through us, and sometimes despite us. Quite often he works despite us, and yet still he loves us and works his purposes out. And that's what we've been looking at. And we've reached a point in our story where I've decided to take a break. It's a natural break. Today we're going to look at Joseph, and we're looking at Genesis 45, as I said, to finish. But actually the story of Joseph goes over more than 10 chapters. It is huge. So please do take the time over the next maybe couple of weeks to read that through for yourself. Check the stuff, because I'm going to give you a kind of a potted history of Joseph, but go back and check that what I'm telling you is correct. Go and read it for yourself, that the interpretation that I've put on things is what you would put on things. Because you know, sometimes we hear stuff and we go, oh yeah, June said this and June said that, and June's got it completely wrong. So please do go and check for yourself and come and speak to me, and we'll have conversations about stuff. I love having conversations about the Bible. I love it. So we're on Joseph. And last week we got to our population explosion as we saw Jacob the cheat become Israel, the father of the nation that was to carry God's name. Did you notice that? I don't think I picked that out so much last week, but Israel. You know that El is like the generic name for God, as in El Shaddai and all of the things like that, El. So Israel carries God's name going forward, Israel. And we were introduced to 11 of Jacob, Israel's sons, from the oldest Reuben to the youngest Joseph. What? We haven't got there yet. Stop it. You're racing ahead. Benjamin hadn't been born yet. When Joseph, do you want to come and, when Joseph was about 10, after they had left Laban and they were back in the land that God had promised to Abraham many years ago now, Rachel became pregnant again. And she gave birth to a son. But unfortunately the story doesn't have a happy ending. We've said that these are stories about real people in real situations, not fairy tales with happy ever afters. And unfortunately, Rachel died in childbirth, giving birth to Benjamin. So Jacob, and I know God changed his name to Israel, but that will get ever so confusing. So I will keep calling him Jacob so that you know who I'm talking about. Jacob was left with his 12 sons and at least one daughter that we know of, though probably many more daughters. And Jacob was a changed man. We saw that last week. But the thing is, we're all changed, aren't we? We are all new creations. Jesus has come in, and by his Holy Spirit says, you know, the old has gone, the new has come, and we're new creations. And yet, as we stand here, we are not perfect. We're not perfect. We still have our faults and our frailties. And Jacob was a changed man, but he wasn't perfect. And I don't know about you, but my parenting skills are not perfect either. And Jacob's parenting skills were not perfect. We know that Rachel was his favourite, the favourite of his wives, the love of his life. And so her sons were very, very precious to him, and particularly Joseph. And Joseph, because of this favouritism, and we see it at the school gates. Don't tell me, those of us that have had children or have stood at school gates, we haven't seen arrogant, spoilt brats with parents who haven't told them off, haven't disciplined them, have shown favouritism, have done everything, have worshipped the child. And that's kind of what happened with Joseph. He grew up to be an arrogant young man. And this kind of always makes me laugh, because my kids when they were younger. They always used to argue with each other which one of them was my favourite, which one of them was Adrian's favourite, and we didn't like to break it to them that we didn't like any of them. That's why we got the dog. But there was no doubting the favouritism that Joseph received. And while the others were out working, and this is quite significant, Joseph was 17, old enough to be out there working, doing his share. But the others were out working, the older ones looking after the sheep. Benjamin by this time would have probably been about 7, so would have been being looked after by one of the servants. But Jacob gave Joseph a gift. This is where you all burst into song. I close my eyes. Thank you. To see for sure. Yes, exactly. A coat that has been called a coat of many colours. It's a mistranslation. It wasn't a coat of many colours at all. It was an ornamented robe. It was a special robe. But those of you who've been and seen the stage show with that wonderful stripy coat that flowed out behind it, was it Philip Schofield? Did you see Philip Schofield? Who else have you seen? Anybody else famous doing it? Jason! Oh, no. He was gorgeous when he was with Charlene, but other than that. So, we now know that that was probably a mistranslation. It was an ornamented robe, it was a special robe, but it wouldn't have been brightly coloured and floating out behind him. But Joseph grew up as a spoiled brat. There's no polite way of saying that, is there? You really do get the impression that he was not a very nice boy at all. And one day he goes to his brothers and he's all puffed up in his fancy coat. And he says, I've had a dream that there were 12 sheaves of wheat, one for each of you and one for each of all the brothers, including Benjamin. And he says, all of your wheat started bowing down to me. Well, just imagine being on the end of that. And you've been on the end of that for 17 years. This was the final straw for the brothers. They'd had enough. And so they decided together to kill Joseph. And then they'd just tell their father that he'd been eaten by a wild animal. I mean, this was a real risk. This could really have happened to Joseph. But Reuben, the oldest one, he seems like the only one to have a bit of decency about him. He convinces the others to throw Joseph into a kind of well that was out in the wilderness that they used to give the animals some water. And Reuben's idea was that when the others had each gone away again with their flocks and their herds, he would come back and he would get Joseph out. He'd probably slap him about a bit, knock him down a peg or two, but safely take him back to his father Jacob. But when Joseph was in the well and Reuben was off somewhere else, a group of slave traders come passing by. And so the rest of the brothers instead decide to sell Joseph to them. And so later on, when Reuben goes back to rescue Joseph, Joseph is not there. And Reuben's in pieces. What on earth is he going to tell their father? He is going to be distraught. And so Joseph finds himself in Egypt. Not by his own choice, a long, long way from home. But he's not alone, because God made a promise to Abraham, to Isaac and Jacob that he would be with them and with their offspring. And God is very definitely with Joseph, though it doesn't always seem like it. And so Joseph is in Egypt, and he's brought by a man named Potiphar. And Potiphar, it calls Potiphar a captain of the guard. Potiphar was an important man in Egypt. He was a man of prominence, a man of status. And it says that God is with Joseph and God blesses Joseph. And Joseph works hard and Joseph is trustworthy. Now just think about that for a minute. Many of us at times have found ourselves where we don't want to be. We haven't been sold into slavery, I don't think, any of us. But it can feel like it, can't it? Working somewhere that you hate, with people that dislike you, or that you dislike, or people that don't value us, or whatever. Work can feel like slavery, can feel like drudgery. Where you find yourself can feel like you're a long way from where you want to be. But instead of moaning and grumbling about his circumstances and making everyone miserable, Joseph sets out to be the best that he can be within the situation that he finds himself. And he does that time and time and time again. When things are good, Joseph is the best that he can be. When things are really tough, Joseph is the best that he can be. And I find that such a challenge, because our natural instinct is to kind of moan, isn't it? But Joseph works hard, he's trustworthy, and God blesses him, so much so that he gets given huge responsibility within Potiphar's house. He's given the position of honour in the house, pretty much unheard of for a slave. Such is the trust that Potiphar has in Joseph. Such is the weight that he places on their relationship that when Potiphar's wife accuses Joseph of attempting to sleep with her, when he is falsely accused, Potiphar has every right, and it would have been right to save face for his family so his wife doesn't lose face. It would have been right that Joseph was executed on the spot. No one would have batted an eyelid. No one would have asked any questions. This is a slave who has attempted to rape the woman of the house, allegedly. Therefore, he should be killed. But he isn't killed. Instead, Joseph is put into the king's prison. Now, again, the king's prison. It wouldn't have been the most pleasant place in the world, but it was certainly better than the alternative. And it wouldn't have been like our images of prisons. I was quite shocked to find this out, actually. I'd always had this picture of, you know, when you watch things like Robin Hood and the films like that, and you watch films that portray the medieval times, they're almost thrown into dirt pits, aren't they, with nothing. This was the king's prison. This was the place where important prisoners were put until they were proved innocent or guilty, until they were on a trial. So it wouldn't have been kind of a 4-star hotel, but it certainly wouldn't have been a dirt pit with rats and stuff. It's not like that. So Joseph's in the king's prison, but God is still with him. And before long, Joseph is working alongside the prison warden, taking care of all the other people in the prison. And again, Joseph worked hard, and Joseph was trustworthy, and Joseph was wise and showed wisdom, so much so that the warden could just leave him to it and know that he was doing a good job. He became as a warder rather than as a prisoner. Do you see? We get the sense all the way through this that God is working in Joseph, that Joseph is changing. Things are changing. Gone or going is the brash, arrogant young man who showed off to his brothers, and instead there's growing up a man of good character, a man who's learning fortitude when times are difficult, a man who is trustworthy, and a man who is learning to trust fully in God. And then one day, 2 high-ranking officials are thrown into the prison, the king's cupbearer and the king's baker, and Joseph finds them kind of puzzled and perplexed because they've had a dream and they can't make sense of it. And Joseph asks God for the interpretation of their dreams, and he tells them what the dreams mean. He says, you know, cupbearer, you're going to be restored to your position. Baker, sadly, you're going to be executed. And all this happens exactly as Joseph said it would. And it starts to look like there's a glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel, and for once it might not be an oncoming train, because the cupbearer promises to tell Pharaoh the king about Joseph. But sadly, as is often the case, out of sight, out of mind, and the cupbearer forgets. And so Joseph is left in the prison. Until one day, Pharaoh himself, the king of all Egypt, has a couple of worrying dreams which none of his magicians or diviners or interpreters or anyone can make head or tail of. And only then, only when everything else is all been tried and found it doesn't work, only then does the cupbearer remember Joseph in prison, the one who was able to interpret his dream correctly. So Joseph is sent for, and we have this wonderful bit in Genesis 40 where Joseph is standing in front of Pharaoh. You know, this kind of descendant of Abraham, this kind of young, arrogant farmer, stands in front of Pharaoh, the king of all Egypt, and he says, you know what? I can't interpret dreams. This isn't about me. This is all God. And so I'll go away and I'll pray and I'll ask God to give me an interpretation, and God will tell you what your dreams mean. And so off Joseph goes, and then he explains to Pharaoh that God is warning him of what is to come. And he says this, he says, there will be 7 years of plenty, 7 good years, followed by 7 years of severe famine. And Joseph tells Pharaoh, if you want Egypt to survive, you have got to take this seriously. You have got to, over the next 7 years, store up enough grain. You have to build storehouses big enough to carry your people through the famine years, or else you will all die. And Pharaoh is so blown away by Joseph and his interpretation and his wisdom of how to solve the problem that he not only listens to him and does everything he says, but he puts Joseph in charge of the whole operation. And he gives him the highest job in Egypt. Now, for a bit of a timeline so we can keep up with where we are, Joseph was 17 when he was sold as a slave to Egypt. And when he interprets Pharaoh's dream, he's been in Egypt for 13 years. So pretty much his whole meaningful adult life. And this brash-mouthy, boastful 17-year-old has been transformed into a 30-year-old man of integrity and wisdom. A man who has learned to trust God because he's had no choice. Far away from home, with all of the problems that he's faced, he has had no one else but God. And so God promotes Joseph to the highest position in Egypt. And it will be through Joseph that the whole line of Jacob will be saved. But not just yet. For the next 7 years, Joseph stored food all over Egypt. And when the famine came, people still had food to eat in Egypt. But the famine, you see, didn't only affect Egypt, it affected all of the lands around as well. To the point where Jacob and his 11 remaining sons up in Canaan were also starving. And they, along with all of the neighbouring people, have heard that there's food in Egypt. And they can go to Egypt and they can buy grain to keep them alive. So Jacob, the father, sends all of the 10 older brothers down to Egypt. But he keeps Benjamin, the youngest one, at home. Now just imagine the scene for a minute. Joseph, in all of his finery, he's the governor of all the land, and he's there at the grain store, meeting with people who want to buy food, he's arranging the prices, how much food they need, and getting all of that sorted out and getting it back when in walk his brothers. Immediately he recognises them. Now, they don't recognise Joseph. Why would they? 13 years ago, they sold him as a slave. They wouldn't have in a million years expected their boastful, arrogant slave brother to be the governor of all Egypt. And so Joseph, you know the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, Joseph hatches a plan that his father, the schemer, would have been proud of. But this plan is a plan to reunite his whole family. But first, Joseph needs to know if they've changed like he has. Have they learnt? Have they grown? Or are they still the same jealous, impetuous, uncaring people that they were before? Joseph accuses his brothers of being spies, and he says, look, if you really are honest people and not spies, then you'll all come to Egypt, all of you, your younger brother as well. And he says, until you do, as a security measure, I'll keep Simeon in Egypt with me until you come back. Well, the brothers are distraught. What on earth will they do? They can't go back to their father with another son gone. He's been mourning the death of Joseph for 20 years now. There's no way he's going to let Benjamin out of his sight. And now they'll be going back to him without Simeon. You can imagine Jacob's reaction when the rest of the brothers get home. Not only that, but when they get home and open up the sacks of grain that they went to buy, they find all of their money inside the bags. What on earth are they going to do now? When I came to this story today, I knew all of this. Again, like you, I've seen the film, I've heard sermons on it for a lot of times. It's one of those stories that we know, we've heard it from Sunday school onwards. And in my head, the chronological order of things was that they got home without Simeon and pretty much immediately packed up and left again for Egypt with Benjamin. But it didn't happen like that. 10 brothers went down to Egypt and 9 brothers came home with at least 9 full sacks of grain. And it wasn't until the grain ran out, it wasn't until there was no other option left, that Jacob allowed the brothers to go back to Egypt with Benjamin. In other words, this was probably quite some significant time later. But eventually, all the brothers do go back to Egypt, and there they're again in front of Joseph, and Joseph is overwhelmed when he sees them. And there's this really touching bit in the story where he has to go off and find a quiet room to cry in, because all of the emotions that are washing over him in seeing his brothers again. And as the story goes on, we see that Joseph really has changed. This is no pretense of change. This is no putting on a brave face. This man has had a heart transplant. All the arrogance and bluster and pride have gone, and now he sits in a position of power where he literally holds his brothers' lives in his hands, and he feels nothing but love. And he wants the family reunited. He wants to see his father again. So he hatches another plan, and we thought Jacob was the schemer. He has their bags of grain packed, but he tells his servant to put his silver cup, his best silver cup, into Benjamin's sack. It's a rotten trick, really. But as the brothers are leaving, he comes out and he accuses them of stealing his silver cup. Obviously they deny it, they know nothing about it. But he has their bags searched from the oldest to the youngest, and there is the cup. And this is where we find out that not only has he changed, but so have his brothers. Because you see, it's Judah who speaks up. Do you remember Judah was the one who wanted to kill him? Judah speaks up and says, we can't go back without Benjamin. We can't. It will kill our father. He's never got over the loss of Rachel. He's never got over the loss of Rachel's son Joseph. And if they go home without Rachel's son Benjamin, well, they'll just send their father straight to his death in heartbreak and misery. And it's at that point that Joseph just can't contain himself anymore, and he breaks down in tears, and he tells his brothers, it's me, Joseph. Let's pick up the story in our Bibles. Genesis 45, verse 1. Please, Aaron. Thank you. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, have everyone leave my presence. So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard all about it. Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still living? But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, come close to me. When they'd done so, he said, I am your brother Joseph, the one who you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed. Do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there's been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no ploughing and no reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve you for a remnant on earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household and ruler of all Egypt. Now hurry back to my father and say to him, this is what your son Joseph says. God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me. Don't delay. You shall live in the region of Goshen and be near me, you, your children and your grandchildren, your flocks and herds and all you have. I will provide for you there, because 5 years of famine are still to come. Otherwise, you and your household and all who belong to you will become destitute. You can see for yourselves, and so can my brother Benjamin, that it is really I who am speaking to you. Tell my father about all the honor accorded me in Egypt, and about everything that you've seen. and bring my father down here quickly." Then he threw his arms around his brother Benjamin and wept, and Benjamin embraced him weeping, and he kissed all his brothers and wept over them. Afterwards, his brothers talked with him. I love that. I just, of all the ways that could have turned out, in my head, I let you in every so often. It is a scary place. In my head, it turns into one of those TV shows, how Long Lost Families. Is that what it's called, or some such like that? And you've got either Davina McCall or Cilla Black or whoever saying, "And here, right now, is the brother that you sold into slavery and haven't seen for over 20 years." Do you know what's just flashed through my head? I'm showing my age now, do, this is your life. Who was it that used to do that? You're showing your age now. Isn't it brilliant? It's almost like he comes out with the red book, and this is the brother that you thought you'd never see again and probably didn't want to see again after what you did to him. And now he's here. And there's the curtain comes back and the big reveal, and then there's lots of tears and hankies and hugs and everything as the reunion happened. And so eventually, when the crying and the hugging had finished, off the brothers went, loaded with carts and oxen, and they fetched their father and all the rest of the family and all the servants and the animals and everything they had, and they went and settled in Egypt, where they were saved from the famine. And if we were to read on a bit further, after their father dies, do you know the brothers still are not sure whether Joseph has really forgiven them or if he just lived in peace with them for the sake of their father? And they go to him and they're frightened. And he says this wonderful thing. He says, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." I just think that's an incredible line. I love that. I think it's wonderful. But people have asked me before, when we've looked at this story, when we've talked about Joseph and everything that happened to him, they sort of said to me, what kind of God does that? I know it all had a happy ending, but actually, what kind of God does that? What kind of a God lets you be sold into slavery and then lets you go to prison? And does the end justify the means? What kind of God does that? And I'm like, I think you've got the cart before the horse. I think you've got it all a bit about face. Let's briefly rethink this from a different angle. Rewind. Joseph's there showing off to his brothers. He's been the favourite for so long. They're out there doing all the work, looking after the sheep and cattle. They're earning their living. And Joseph is swanning around in his fancy coat, however you think it looks. The thing is, whatever this coat looked like, it's what it signified that was important. This coat would have signified status. This would have said, Joseph, the younger brother, is over you. He's management, your workers. He's the supervisor. He's in charge. He has status. That's what this coat would have said. And their resentment, the resentment of the older brothers, had developed into hatred to the point where they'd plotted together to kill him. And they would have killed him. It would have been easy to do. But providentially, coincidentally, God incidentally, along comes a caravan of traders, and instead of being killed, Joseph's life is spared. Once he was in Egypt, Joseph could have gone to work anywhere across the whole of Egypt. He could have gone to work as a farmhand. He could have worked in any number of awful jobs. But providentially, coincidentally, or did God arrange it? That actually he goes to work for Potiphar, someone hugely influential. And the Bible clearly tells us that God blesses Joseph and God blesses Potiphar while Joseph is in his house. This boy might be a long way from home, but he's certainly not a long way from God. God blesses Joseph so much that Potiphar gives him a position of respect and authority in the house, which means that when he's falsely accused of rape, instead of being instantly executed, he goes to prison. As I said, it's not great, but it beats the alternative. And again, God blesses him so much in prison that before long he has a position of authority and respect in prison. And then providentially, coincidentally, Joseph happens to be in prison when the royal officials are thrown in there, and they have dreams that God gives Joseph the interpretation for, and so it goes on. And we see how Joseph happens to be in the right place at the right time and time again. And how, even when things look to be absolutely terrible, actually God is very clearly with Joseph. So many times things could have ended differently. So many times this could have been the end for Joseph. And actually, from his point of view, so many times he could have looked at what was happening to him and he could have moaned and grumbled about what he doesn't have, about how unfair it is, about all the things that he's dealing with. But instead, he looked at what he did have and he recognized how God had blessed him. He saw God's hand at work. He saw God's providence. Now, I don't for a minute believe that God planned for his brothers to throw him down a well and then sell him into slavery. Do not for a minute believe that. The brothers don't get away with it that easily. If this is all God ordained and God intended for this to happen, that he would be thrown down in a well, then the brothers are well and truly off the hook, aren't they? But God used their mess. He used their mistakes and he redeemed it. And he used it and he embroidered it into his great tapestry of salvation. You see, if Joseph wasn't in Egypt, the family could very well have died, or at least suffered greatly, if not completely died out when the famine hit. But because of Joseph, there was an escape plan. There was a way that the descendants of Abraham could be saved and could thrive and be blessed. Joseph could have been so bound up in bitterness and hatred at what his brothers had done to him. How many people do we know who haven't spoken to members of their family for so many years? So deep is the grudge that they hold. And yet, when Joseph literally held their lives in his hand, he responded with grace and mercy and forgiveness and love. What a challenge to us. What a real challenge. There was then another huge miracle of reconciliation, every bit as big as Esau and Jacob that we saw last week. But as I read this story, as I read through the life of Joseph, the thing that keeps coming back to me again and again and again is that God is in control. This doesn't mean that everything in our lives is going to be all sweetness and light every single day. Jacob had more than his fair share of grief. Joseph had more than his fair share of injustice. Sold into slavery and then into prison for a crime he didn't commit. But God was always in control. And God used the whole mess to bring salvation to his people. But in a way that those people living through that wouldn't have lived to see the end. We know the end because we've got the whole story in our Bibles. They just had to trust God, that he was in control and he would use this whole mess to bring salvation to his people. You know, I know what some of you are going through. I don't know what all of you are going through today. You know, some of us are facing more than our fair share of grief. As we sit in this room, some of us are facing more than our fair share of pain, more than our fair share of hurt, the way we've been treated, more than our fair share of injustice. Life isn't fair, is it? No one ever said it would be. But if we put our trust in God, if we learn from Joseph, if we learn to fully rely on him, if we learn to be the best that we can be through the help of the Holy Spirit, in whatever circumstances we find ourselves in, we will see God's hand at work. There's a verse in the New Testament that sums up the whole of the Joseph story for me in 2 lines. You're like, why couldn't you have just said this at the start? Romans 8 verse 28. You know it. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who loved him, who have been called according to his purpose. Isn't that wonderful? We know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. That doesn't mean that everything will always be wonderful all the time, but it does remind us and reassure us that God is in control. And even when we feel so far from home, we are never far from him. He is with us always. We're going to sing now a song, my favourite. We sing it often here now, so hopefully we're getting to know it. It's that song that says, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, your perfect love is casting out fear. And the chorus with the promise, oh no, you never let go. Through the calm and through the storm, you never let go of me. Let's sing this and let's remember that God is in control, that he is with us, and that he is working all things out for the good of those who love him, who are called according to his purposes.